Welcome back to part 2. We're going to be assembling our large cradled artist panel, but first a quick recap of all the steps we've taken to get us this far. But not before I defend myself from the reptilian aliens that can control my thoughts. There. That's so much better. First, I cut down the boards that would be used for the outer wall pieces. These were cut slightly longer than the dimension listed in the source material. That extra little bit of length is needed to make sure I don't cut the boards too short. Second, I cut the cross brace pieces to their exact lengths as per the diagram. Once the pieces were cut, I immediately moved on to the 90-degree sled, cutting the mitered ends on side 1 and 2 of the outer wall stock. Next, I set up the cross-cut sled on my table saw to cut the dado grooves out of the outer wall pieces. The dado grooves are what will lock in all the cross brace pieces when fully assembled. Once that was complete, I then set up the table saw to remove the material for the half-lap joinery where the cross braces will overlap at each intersection. Now that all the blade milling is done, it was then time to set up and use the router table to carve dado grooves into the outer wall and center brace pieces, according to the specs outlined in the source material. These dado grooves will receive some corner bracing components that I'll be cutting later on in this video. And that brings us to where we are now. The first stage of assembly. Now that most of the pieces are cut and milled to spec, let's continue on to the assembly portion of this video. Right after this. In case you didn't know, the YouTube algorithm ranks videos lower by default if they don't have a call to action in them. So, in order to appease the virtual egos of my digital overlords, here's the part where I ask you to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. The algorithm tracks engagement. So if you click the like button, it basically lets SKYNET know that I'm a good human who makes content that you, the viewer, likes. And if they see that you like it, they'll be inclined to recommend it to other viewers with similar interests. Which helps. So, if you could, please mash all the appropriate buttons. Now let's cut the small talk, and move on to the good stuff. Do you remember earlier, in part 1? When I said my cross-bracing half-lap joints didn't quite fit, and I had to take the pieces back to the table saw to remove a little more material? It turns out the scrap I used to set the dado blade height had a slight size discrepancy of about 1/16 of an inch to the stock being used. When I went to dry fit all the parts together, I noticed the half-lap joints weren't even close. I figured out the problem, then took an additional 1/16 inch out from all the cross bracing. After that, the fit was perfect. Other than that, everything is looking good. The cross bracing aligns with the dado grooves cut out for them as expected. It's critical to make sure the cross bracing ends fit into the 1/4 inch deep dado grooves before gluing them up. And, by now, you should start to get a sense of how the dados for the corner bracing will align. The methods and techniques used to glue up the cross brace portion of this art panel were covered in my last video. So, with a little movie magic, I'm going to skip ahead. But just to reiterate the main points, all you have to do is put glue in the half-lap joints, make sure the joint overlaps sit flush with one another, then set the newly glued cross bracing aside to dry. Make sure to set the cross bracing pieces square before allowing the glue to set up. Here, I'm using my homemade 90-degree angle jigs to do just that. If you want to watch my previous video on how the cross brace section was glued up, just click the link. Before we glue up the outer wall portion of the cradle, we're going to run into another problem that is unique to building larger sized panels. And that problem is that the ratcheting corner clamp isn't long enough to go around the perimeter of the cradle frame. So, to remedy that, we're going to replace the original ratcheting strap with 2 standard tie-down straps purchased at the big box goods store. We'll need to hook them to each other for this to work. Here, let me demonstrate how to do it for you. Simply take the plastic corners off the original ratchet strap, and place 2 of them on one of the tie-downs. Move them roughly into position on the tie-down strap. The hook end of the tie-down strap should end about halfway along the edge of the frame. Simply hook the other tie-down strap to it, and continue around the perimeter of the frame, placing the plastic corners in the approximate positions where they'll need to be. You'll want to take as much slack out of both strap lines as you can, without having to use the ratchet, at this point. Here's an illustration to give you the full view of how the tie-down straps will connect. Because there's a bit of unevenness on the surface that I'm using to glue up my cradle walls, some corners aren't sitting proud of their counterpart. We'll just need to use the rubber mallet and make minor adjustments to them once there's some tension on the straps. Remove one end of the cradle wall, and apply glue to the mitered edges. Then gently put it back into its place, inside the corner clamps. Repeat these steps for the other side. I didn't want the ratchet buckle to hit the corner clamp piece. So, while there was a little tension on the strap, I slid the entire strap ribbon to the side and into a better position. Then I started to apply some pressure to the mitered edges using the ratchet. Not too much pressure though. We don't want the frame bending due to over-tightening. For any corners that are not laying flush to one another, simply tap on them with a rubber mallet to get them to line up. Just tap gently. It doesn't take much to get them to comply. With the strap pressure applied, it's time to let the glue set up. But it's important to check for square before we do. And we need to clamp it so the glue cures in that position. Once again, a little bit of movie magic to help speed things along. After sufficient time for the glue to set up, I gave the cross bracing a dry fit inside the clamped outer walls before glue up, to make sure there will be no problems once the glue is applied. Be sure to label which end of the cross bracing fit into which side of the cradle walls. I marked mine with an A. I'll show you in just a second. For now it's important to notice how all the gaps in dado seal up. If there's any issues, fix them now before applying any glue. To get the cross bracing out, simply tap gently near each dado with a rubber mallet. Be sure to work your way around the cradle, tapping each section out a little bit at a time, until the cross bracing comes out. Apply a fair amount of glue to each of the 1/4 inch dados. Then gently reinsert the cross bracing lattice. Gather up a few scraps of wood, as well. We're going to need them to apply pressure around the cross bracing using the ratchet straps. We set the scrap pieces right where the dado joints are, so that the tension from the strap doesn't cut into our cradle. I tried filming the next part to illustrate the cross brace clamping process, but I was running out of time. The glue was starting to set up, and with all the slack laying about, it just looked like a jumbled mess, as you can see. So I made these next slides to better explain. In an ideal world, you'd leave the corner clamps in place. Then slip the scrap pieces in between the corner clamp ribbon and the frame. To clamp them, you'd run more straps between the scrap wood and frame clamp, as shown. To do this requires 6 straps. But I only have 4. So I remove the strap from the outside cradle frame, and drive some brad nails into the corners just off camera. That way, they won't separate when applying pressure to the cross bracing dado joints. With the corners nailed in, and the straps now clamping down on the dado joints, it's time to let it sit overnight, so that all the glue joints can form a tight bond. If you're following along, your cradle should look something like this. While the cradle support structure is drying, I rip down some 1/4 inch plywood. Then I use the cross-cut sled, and a roofing square, to quickly cut up structural support triangles to 4 inch lengths. I also rip down some 5 inch stock out of 3/4 inch plywood that will be used as corner supports for the innermost half-lap joints. You'll need 20 pieces total for the 1/4 inch thick triangles. And only 4 of the 3/4 inch thick. The 3/4 inch piece of wood being cut is very small. So, out of an abundance of caution, I'm going to use a hold down stick to keep my hands away from the blade. It's time now to remove all the straps and start gluing in the structural support triangles we just finished cutting. If you're having a hard time getting the triangles to go in easily, don't worry. So did I. I had to sand down the perpendicular edges of all the triangles just a little bit. And only on the edges. It really didn't take much to make them fit inside the grooves. I marked the edges with some light pencil marks. Once the marks are gone, I know I've sanded them down enough. Dry fitting the piece again, it goes right in. With a little persuasion, of course. I add a decent amount of glue to the edges before tapping them in, and working my way around the entire cradle frame. Be quick to wipe up any excess glue that may have squeezed out. I leave that out to dry overnight before installing the heavier inside corner supports. The structural triangles may seem like a lot of work, and they are. But if you want to be a professional artist, this level of care and craftsmanship that goes into building your painting supports is exactly what it takes. All the joints are points of articulation. That means if moisture starts warping the wood, the distortion will either originate from, or traverse those joints. So we need to arrest motion in them as much as possible. Without any structural support, this is the amount of play throughout the cradle. That is way too much. These heavy 3/4 inch triangles will go on the edge of the cradle that is opposite of where the surface will be attached. Simply apply a good amount of glue and clamp it tight into place. Repeat these steps for the other 3 remaining corner braces as well. The finished cradle wall should now be ready to attach the surface to. But before you do, let's do a structural integrity check of before and after. Using only moderate amounts of pressure, this is how sturdy the cradle has become. Here's the footage side by side for comparison. Yes, bracing the joints is a lot of work. And yes, it's absolutely necessary to do so. Professionalism demands it. By rough estimation, I'd say we've managed to reduce the amount of play by at least 75 to 80%. We've also increased the overall structural integrity of the entire frame. Well done. The only thing left to do now is to mount the Luan surface. To do that, just follow the exact same instructions for mounting the surface that I outlined in my second video, how to build medium-size artist panels. It's been a wild journey from start to finish, but I'm glad you made it to the end. I hope you learned something useful here that will help elevate your creative game and set you on the career path you've always dreamed of, just like learning these skills did for me. If you want to thank me, please do so by mashing all the engagement buttons on your way out the door. Or drop a comment down below. That's it for this tutorial. Thanks for playing along. I'm 𝗕𝗂𝗶𝗹𝗲, and I'll see you next time. Yeah? Well, would you look at that?